Good afternoon and welcome to the next MedTech Europe webinar. Topic of today's webinar is Quality Management System. The webinar will be delivered by our guest, an expert, Dr. Imon Hoxie, who spent 16 years with the UK Medical Devices Agency, and he was Johnson & Johnson Executive Director for Quality and Compliance. Imon, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar on the implications for quality management systems of the European IVD and medical devices regulations. What we're going to cover is a brief overview of a reminder of some of the timelines, then look at the quality management system obligations of manufacturers, the links of that to the conformity assessment requirements, what the findings of gap assessments against for the quality management system are tending to find. Then look at how we would need to manage the changes that we have to the quality management system and we need to implement, how this all links with EN ISO 13485 2016 edition, and highlight some of those QMS requirements which are not covered in that latest edition of ISO 13485. And then just a few concluding remarks before we take a few questions. So in terms of the timelines, as everyone will be familiar, the regulations for medical devices and IVDs entered into force in May 2017 with either a 3 or a 5-year transition period, after which the date of application comes along. As we go through that process, we have several different timelines then built into that. So the designation of notified bodies against the regulations, they could apply in November of 2017, and are going through, many of them are currently actually going through their assessments for the new regulations. The date of designation is not entirely clear, but expected to be sometime in 2019. There are some requirements of the regulations which will come in with later implementing dates. So UDI, for example, some of the dates for implementation of that are a little bit longer, and I've illustrated just a couple of those implementation dates for Class 3 and implantable devices and Class D IVDs. And Class 2 medical devices, which come in the timescales that we have on this slide. At the end of the transition period, devices will be able to be continued to be placed on the market for a period of up to 4 years, using certificates against the MDD or the IVDD. However, some of the requirements not related to those certificates from the new regulations will apply, such as those for economic operators, for post-market surveillance and vigilance. So for anybody who wants to place a medical device onto the market during the transition period against the new regulations, or to use their certificates after the date of application, they will need to have made the quality management system changes that are required by the regulations by the end of the transition period in order to continue placing those products on the market, or to place those products on the market. They will need to meet the requirements for the quality management system in the regulation at that point during the transition period when they introduce them to the market. I've just put on the bottom of this slide the transition for EN ISO 13485 2016, which was published in March of 2016 and had a 3-year transition period itself. So we have about 10 months left of that transition period until February 2019, when all certificates to that version of the standard will need to be updated to the new version. So there's a lot of change going on and a lot of management of that change that needs to be recognised and taken forward in a systematic and planned manner. The medical device regulations and the IVD regulations in Article 10 in the general obligations of the manufacturer require all manufacturers to establish, document, implement, maintain, keep up to date, and continually improve a quality management system. And as well as producing medical devices that are safe and perform as intended, that quality management system is intended to ensure compliance with the regulations. So one of the outputs that is expected by the regulations is that all manufacturers, even Class 1 manufacturers who do not require oversight by a notified body, have a quality management system, and one of the outputs of that quality management system is compliance with the regulatory requirements that apply. That's continued on in Article 10, where it talks about that the QMS governs the structure, responsibilities, procedures, processes, and resources to achieve compliance with the regulation. So clearly linked to driving compliance with the regulation through the procedures and processes of the quality management system. Paragraph 9 in Article 10 then goes on to define in a certain amount of detail the requirements that need to be included in that quality management system. And it is a holistic quality management system that is intended to deliver that compliance with the regulations. So it includes incorporating the general safety and performance requirements from Annex 1 into the design of the medical device. Includes having the risk management requirements implemented through the quality management system, as well as the clinical evaluation and the implementation of the unique device identification, the UDI requirements, the post-market surveillance system, the communication with competent authorities, notified bodies, the processes for reporting under the vigilance requirements. All of those regulatory aspects are seen as elements or aspects covered by the quality management system, as well as some of the things that we would always expect to see: the responsibility of management, the resource management, product realization processes, corrective and preventive actions, and the way that product and processes are monitored and analyzed. So all of those elements need to be in this holistic quality management system, which provides a framework onto which the relevant regulatory requirements can be connected. There's some more detail in some aspects of the quality management system than in Annex 9 of the regulations. I focused on Annex 9. There's also conformity assessment procedures in Annex 11, but in many instances those refer back to Annex 9. So for the purposes of keeping this presentation relatively simple, I've focused on those requirements as they appear in Annex 9 in each of the regulations. And Annex 9 does give some more detail of the documentation that needs to be provided to the notified body for their assessment, and that includes aspects such as the manufacturer's quality objectives, how the organisation how the business is organised in terms of its structures, and how it monitors the implementation of its quality management system, how it controls suppliers and subcontractors, and how it manages its relationship with an authorised representative if it's a manufacturer located outside of the European Union. It goes on to talk about having a strategy for regulatory compliance and spells out 5 aspects that need to be covered by that strategy for regulatory compliance. How the relevant legal requirements are going to be identified and qualified, how devices are going to be classified, if equivalence with an existing device is used as part of the demonstration of meeting the requirements, how that is going to be handled, and which conformity assessment procedures are going to be used. How the applicable general safety and performance requirements are identified, including how common specifications and harmonised standards are going to be applied, how design and construction and evaluation, particularly preclinical evaluation, is going to be handled, the information to be supplied with the device in the IFU or the labelling, the identification procedures and the traceability procedures, and how changes to the design of the device or to the quality management system are going to be managed. So many organizations are now looking at how to implement the changes, and implementing them really starts with a gap assessment against the new requirements. So a kind of generic process for doing that would be to map the regulations to the QMS so that you know where to look in your quality management system, or where you'd expect to find the processes and procedures for meeting those regulatory aspects. Link that to the procedures in your quality management system, evaluate them against the new requirements, and it will record those gaps. Review those gaps and assess what action is needed, prioritize, and then determine what solutions are required. So that's going to give you some kind of mapping of your QMS and the gaps within it, and some sort of matrix of where those gaps are, and the effort that will be required to close them, and usually some kind of summary for management of the areas in which most of the gaps appear. And generically, as you would likely expect, most of the gaps tend to be identified in areas where the requirements are either completely new or have changed completely. Because if we're already in compliance with the current requirements, then it's only when there's new or changed requirements that you would expect to identify gaps. And some of the areas which come up from the regulations relate to the relationship with other economic operators in the supply chain in Chapter 2, the interaction with the UDAMED database, and the preparation of summaries of safety and performance, or safety and clinical performance, the performance evaluation or the clinical evaluation process in Chapter 4, in Chapter 7, the requirements on vigilance and market surveillance, the Annex 6 requirements on UDI, and the Annex 14 requirements on performance evaluation for IVDs, or clinical performance and follow-up for medical devices. Those are the areas where most of the gaps in general tend to be identified. If you want to look then at those gaps and how they map against the requirements of the Quality Management System standard, ISO 13485, which is the standard that many organizations use to structure their quality management system, then I've kind of shown that in this slide. So the aspects on the QMS structure and document management, which are in Clause 4 of the standard, a lot of that detail is in Annex 9 of the regulations, such as things like the quality manual, the person responsible for regulatory compliance, and the technical documentation are some of those big areas that you'll find need to be addressed there. When it comes to management controls, aspects like management review, change control, training, supply control, and internal audit relate right through the standard and to Chapters 2.8 and Annex 9 in the medical device or the IVD regulation. The product realization aspects tend to focus on the design controls, the clinical or performance evaluation processes, risk management, the control of substances which might be carcinogenic, mutagenic, or endocrine disrupting, the management of the medical device life cycle, and for some conformity assessment processes for some classes of device, the batch verification system. That's focused on Annex 7 in the standard, and Chapters 2, 6, Annex 1, and Annex 9 of the regulation. And when it comes from product measurement and analysis, things like complaint handling, vigilance, post-market surveillance, field safety corrective actions, and periodic summary update reports in Chapters 7 and Annex 9, then that maps into to Clause 8 in the regulations. We also need to be aware that some of those gaps relate to the control of economic operators. That's in Chapter 3 in the regulations, and would map to Clause 4 in the standard. The scope of the quality management system, and if it now covers devices that might be considered aesthetic devices and have now, without a medical purpose, which have now been brought under the medical device regulations, that would really relate to defining the scope of the quality management system in Clause 4. How the organisation is going to interact, particularly electronically, with the regulatory authorities through the UDIMED system, maps to clauses 7 and 8 in the standard and Chapter 3 in the regulations. The labelling requirements tend to relate to your supply chain processes, together with the UDI processes, are in Clause 7 for product realisation. But Chapter 2 in the regulations themselves. So that just kind of gives you a very high-level mapping of where some of these requirements are likely to fit in the structure of ISO 13485. So in regards to the status of EN ISO 13485, the 2016 version, that was formally harmonised in November of 2017 and added to the list of harmonised standards in the official journal for the existing directives, the active implantable, the medical device, and the IVD directives. And so it gives a presumption of conformance with the conformity assessment requirements within the limitations of the Annex Zs, which are included in that document. And so that harmonisation exists for the current directives. Standards cannot be harmonised against the new regulations until there is a standardisation request from the European Commission to the European Standards Organisations, and that has been negotiated and agreed. That process has started, but is not yet complete. So there are no standards that are yet harmonised against the new regulations. However, as an interim step, on the 21st of March, SEN published a technical report, TR 17223, describing the relationship between the regulations and ISO 13485. So this doesn't have the legal status of an Annex Z, it doesn't have any presumption of conformity, but it does present some consensus of how the requirements in the regulation do map to the clauses in the standard in quite a bit of detail. In contrast to what you might be used to seeing in an Annex Z, because it's a technical report, there is a little bit more freedom in format that comes with that. It actually includes the text of the regulation. There's a table for the medical device regulation, a separate table for the IVD regulation, and it maps both the articles and the relevant conformity assessment annexes. So it maps Article 10 and the conformity assessment annexes to a column of the references in 13485 and some comments on the extent to which those requirements are covered by the standard. So that document is available now from national standards bodies throughout the European throughout SEN, the SEN membership. So the quality management system is based on a plan to check act cycle. You plan the activities that you need to implement. You implement those activities. You monitor whether they've achieved the results that you intended, and if there's any gap between the intended results and the output, then you take action to change the process to do that. Within the standard, there are essentially 5 clauses of the standard. The quality management system on this slide is represented by the black box, and then Clause 5 represents the management responsibility, Clause 6 resource management, Clause 7 product realization, and Clause 8 measurement, analysis and improvement. And this diagram illustrates the process approach that's used in the standard, where management within within the context of the quality management system, the management is responsible for identifying the customer and regulatory requirements and allocating resources. Those resources, together with the requirements, are inputted into the product realization process. The output of that is product, which goes to customers who provide feedback. The product realization process and the feedback from customers is measured, analyzed, identified as opportunities for improvement, which is fed back to management, who change the requirements or the resources allocated to make that change. And that gives you a cycle of improvement within the quality management system. And that's the system that 13485 is based on. I'm going to use that kind of structure to talk about where some of the changes were introduced in 13485 of 2016, and show how many of those changes link to the requirements of the regulations, and then highlight as well some of the areas where maybe the standard does not reflect all of the detailed requirements that are in the regulation. So in terms of the QMS system in general, in 13485 there is a lot more detail on planning and controlling changes to the quality management system. So in clause 4.1.4, the first bit of text there, to manage the changes in accordance with the requirements of the standard and applicable regulatory requirements, is consistent with the previous version, but there's more detail in the bullet points underneath, particularly in regard to the changes being evaluated for their impact on the medical devices and the impact on the meeting regulatory requirements. So that goes along with an emphasis on managing change to the quality management system within the regulations as well. The standard has requirements for QMS planning, and the planning of the quality management system has to be carried out, and the integrity of the quality management system has to be maintained when it is undergoing any changes and those changes are implemented. So recognizing that the changes to 13485 itself and implementing the regulations are going to have require changes to the quality management system, it's really important that you demonstrate that those changes are controlled through the quality management system processes. So the expectation is there would be quality planning, there would be a plan for how the changes are going to be implemented, who's going to do them, in what order, and what those changes need to be. That is reviewed and agreed at management review, and the resources needed to make those changes are available and monitored. The training on the changes and the new requirements is provided. That the internal audit process is updated to reflect those new requirements. That the skills of the internal auditors are upgraded to reflect those changes, and the internal audit system is used to monitor that the changes are being introduced effectively. That the purchasing system is used where processes are outsourced or it has impact on suppliers, that is controlled, those changes are controlled and managed through the purchasing process. And until the point that the regulations are applicable, you are in a mode of undertaking a preventive action, really, to prevent yourself becoming out of compliance with the new regulatory requirements. So the requirements for preventive action, again, for many things like planning and documenting, would apply here. Moving on to look at some of the requirements for management responsibility. Some of the requirements in the standard around management review have been updated, particularly around documentation and addressing changing regulatory requirements. So on this slide, I've just highlighted some of the new inputs that are now explicitly required for management review. So management review has to include information from complaint handling, reporting to regulatory authorities, audits, be they internal or external audits, process monitoring and product monitoring. So effectively now what's been done is that the Inputs to management review reflect the topics in the measurement analysis and improvement section in Clause 8. Previously, there were some of the requirements in 8 were required to be inputs into management review, but not all of them, and now it's been made consistent. Secondly, the output for management review needs to be recorded and include decisions and actions related to not only maintaining the effectiveness of the quality management system, but also the suitability and adequacy, and explicitly address changes needed to respond to new or revised regulatory requirements. Looking at the relationship in 13485 to regulatory requirements, there's now a lot more detail with regard to the regulatory role of the organisation and the coverage of the supply chain, the expectations for what's in European terms often been called the technical file, or now the technical documentation, how interactions with regulatory authorities are going to be managed and undertaken, and a need to promote awareness of regulatory requirements throughout the organisation, as well as quality management system requirements. So looking at that in more detail, there's now a new requirement in the standard for the organisation to document its role, or roles if it has multiple roles, under applicable regulatory requirements. So it's expecting to see documented somewhere whether the organisation is a manufacturer, an authorised rep, an importer, a distributor, a combination of those, a contract manufacturer, a logistics provider, a design house, an organisation that solely develops specifications for products through design and development. Whatever that regulatory role, in whatever regulations are applicable, it's now requiring that those are documented within the quality management system, that role or those roles. There's now a separate subclause with its own title and number on the medical device file. Consistent with the previous version of 13485, the medical device file was intended to contain or reference documents to meet the applicable regulatory requirements. So that would be to meet the requirements for the technical documentation from a European context, the device master record in a US FDA context, etc. What's been added is not an exhaustive list of the content of the file, but a very generic list of the common features that appear in the technical documentation, irrespective of the jurisdiction. So it gives you a high-level list, but up in the paragraph above, I just draw your attention to the fact that you have to input the specific applicable regulatory requirements for the jurisdiction into the requirements for how you manage your medical device file under 13485. The regulations require that the manufacturer gives access to the notified body to the documentation, and that the documentation is presented in a clear, organised, ready, searchable and unequivocal way. So there are requirements on how you manage your technical documentation, as there are requirements in 13485 for being able to access the current copies of all documents in the quality management system. So there is more detail in the IVDR and the MDR in terms of the technical documentation content. This detail goes above the generic list that's in ISO 13485 and includes information on the post-market surveillance system, which is not included in that list in 13485. So what's not in 13485, which is included in the regulations? So as I just mentioned and illustrated, that complete detail of that technical documentation, things like the summary of safety of performance or summary of safety and clinical performance, that post-market surveillance information, how you're going to interact with the UDAMED database, and the content of your strategy for regulatory compliance. That's not mentioned in 13485 itself. And as I highlighted a little bit earlier, there are 5 points that are required to be in the strategy for regulatory compliance. The processes for identifying the relevant legal requirements, the qualification of those, meeting those requirements, classification of the device, how that's going to be managed, the use of equivalence as justification for meeting requirements with the device, and the conformity assessment procedures are all the required elements. But I just put forward a proposal that if you're preparing that document, it might also be a suitable place to document the regulatory role of the organisation, which is required by 13485 that we've just talked about. The position or positions that will have the designation of persons responsible for regulatory responsibilities, which notified bodies you're going to work with, how you're going to use standards and common specifications, how you're going to manage relationship with other economic operators in the supply chain, how you're going to interact with the UDAMED database, and how you're going to communicate, or roles and responsibilities for communicating with competent authorities and notified bodies, are also possible things that you already need to document that might be consistent with the idea of having a documented strategy for regulatory compliance. So going on to talk a little bit about that person responsible for regulatory compliance, that position is not detailed in 13485 as it's not general regulatory requirements globally, but the requirements for competence, for designating roles and responsibilities, fitting that into the organisation chart. Once that position is established in the quality management system, then all of those other requirements of ISO 13485 would apply to that position or those positions in the organisation. Going on then to look at the changes in 13485 with relation to the design and development controls. There's now explicit reference to requirements for usability, identifying applicable standards, providing user training where that will be needed for the device to be used safely and perform as intended, to document the plans for verification and validation of the design, consideration of interfaces between different medical devices that are used together, specific new sub-clauses on design transfer, how product moves from design and development into production, and the records, the design and development records that need to be kept, and added detail on the handling of changes to designs. So at a high level, those are all the changes. Looking in a little bit more detail, the design inputs now explicitly cite usability and applicable standards as design inputs. Then as the design process moves through, you need to see how those inputs are addressed as outputs and verify and validate that the outputs meet the inputs. And a little bit more detail has been added on the design inputs requirements. Need to be not only complete and ambiguous and not in conflict with each other, but they need to be able to be verified or validated. Design validation now has a greater emphasis on the plan for validation, which needs to be explicitly needs to be documented, and that plan needs to include the validation methods, the acceptance criteria, and and statistical techniques are going to be applied, and needs to be carried out on demonstrably representative product. Indication of what that representative product might be. It also goes on as well, continuing to need clinical evaluation or performance evaluation in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements, an explicit mention of interface and validating that the device works as intended when connected to or used with medical devices when that's the intention, and the validation being completed prior to release of product to the customer. The new clause on design and development transfer. Previously there was a note in planning that you should include how you're going to transfer the device into production as part of the plan. Now it's a requirement for there to be a documented procedure for that transfer that ensure that the outputs are verified as suitable for manufacturing before the specifications are finalized, and that you've got the capability to produce the device that you've designed. Also now explicitly requires that design changes that are handled in accordance with documented procedures, and that you look at the significance of the change to the function, performance, usability, safety, and meeting regulatory requirements for the device and its intended use. So more detail in 13485, which is consistent with the detail or the expectations of greater focus on changes in the regulations as well. So what's not in 13485? An explicit mention of the general safety and performance requirements. Those would be regulatory requirements that are needed as design inputs, but they're not mentioned explicitly or referred to explicitly. The need for performance evaluation, performance studies and post-market performance follow-up for IVDs or clinical evaluation and post-market clinical follow-up for medical devices. 13485 requires you to do it in conformance with regulatory requirements, so you would need to take those regulatory requirements from the medical device regulation or the IVD regulation and input those into your procedures in the quality management system. Similarly for clinical investigations, there's just a reference to conducting those in accordance with regulatory requirements. So moving on to look at some of the areas that have been changed in product realization. The first one I'm going to look at is changes related to purchasing controls. There's a focus on outsourcing, again consistent with what's in the regulation, where you use another organisation to do something on your behalf. 13485 makes it clear that the organisation retains responsibility for the processes that it outsources, and if something is outsourced, there has to be a written quality agreement with the supplier of that service. The purchasing controls section has been reorganised to try and make it a bit more logical in terms of its flow of evaluating and selecting suppliers, monitoring and their performance, and re-evaluating suppliers in a kind of systematic order. And it talks about, really gives you some criteria here for a risk-based approach, whereby you put greater emphasis on suppliers of processes or products which have a greater risk to the safety and performance of the device or to meeting regulatory requirements. In terms of the information that's provided when purchasing information, when there's a need to specify details of how personnel at the suppliers' organisations need to be qualified, then that's detailed, and a requirement to have a written agreement of changes from the supplier if they make changes to their product or process. In the verification of things which are purchased, it again gives a risk-based approach that the extent of verification is based on the risk associated with the purchased product and on the supplier evaluation results. So it does link how much oversight of the output that you have to have back to the evaluation that you've undertaken of the capabilities of that supplier. And it goes on to say that if the organisation becomes of changes to the purchased product, have to determine whether those changes affect the product realization process or explicitly the medical device, again with a focus on the safety and performance of that device. The next aspect of product realization is about incorporating UDI into the quality management system. So the 13485 requires that where there are regulatory requirements for a UDI system, that the way that is identified and implemented is an element of the quality management system. But there isn't details of what the UDI system needs to look like in 13485 itself. It would refer you back to the regulations for that. It also doesn't give you all the details of what has to be on the label and the IFU, but again, those need to meet the applicable regulatory requirements. Or implant cards are not referenced, or again, how you're going to interact with the Unimed database. Those are explicit regulatory requirements that the detail of which are not shown in 13485. So moving on to the customer feedback, 13485 has made some changes with regard to both complaint handling and with regard to post-market surveillance. So the reference to post-market surveillance is in the feedback clause in 8.2.1. It's referred to a little bit obliquely, but it says, highlighted at the bottom of this slide, if the regulatory requirements require the organisation to gain specific experience from post-production activities, that is code to undertake post-market surveillance, that shall be part of the feedback process, and all the requirements of the feedback process apply to that. There is now a separate clause on complaint handling. Previously it was incorporated within the general text on the general text under feedback, now has its own clause number. There's more detail of the procedures, what needs to be in the procedures in terms of the process, but otherwise is pretty consistent with what was in the standard to the standard before. Again, a separate sub-clause identified on reporting to regulatory authorities. So if you have to report adverse events or the issuance of advisory notices for field safety corrective actions or other actions, then you have to have documented procedures for doing that in accordance with 13485. So moving on, we're going to look finally at the improvement requirements in the standard, where there's a much greater link to the medical device safety and performance, and again reference here to post-market surveillance, and some changes in regard to corrective action and preventive action, explicitly that those need to be planned and that corrective actions need to be implemented in a timely manner. So in general, one of the changes that's been made to the improvement section is that the previous text had referred to maintaining the suitability, adequacy and effectiveness of the quality management system. But what's been added is that medical device safety and performance, that has to be maintained, that has to be maintained as well. And the route to doing that is through post-market surveillance. So there is a much stronger link here in the improvement section to the post-market surveillance system. So what's not required by 13485? The new regulations now refer to not just improvement of the quality management system, but explicitly refer to continual improvement. That word continual is not included in 13485, although the mechanisms to have continual improvement are actually included in the standard. The detailed regulatory requirements about the person responsible for regulatory compliance, some of their responsibilities link back to clause 8 in the standard, but that's a position that's not explicitly mentioned, as we discussed before. Some of the detail around post-market surveillance and the reporting and planning of those activities, the detail of the vigilance timeline and the criteria would need to be taken from the regulatory requirements and put into the procedures, and again how to interact with the with the UNIMED database is also not explicitly referred to. So, in summary, the IVD regulation and the medical device regulation entered into force in May 2017 with a 3-year transition period for medical devices and a 5-year transition period for in vitro diagnostics, as well as the EU countries. That covers the European economic areas, some accession countries, and other countries that accept CE marking. So it does cover quite a large geographic area and may be the route that's used to support market access in quite a lot of countries around the world. The quality management system needs to be changed to meet some of the requirements in the new regulation, and essentially the QMS really provides a framework for planning and implementing your transition and demonstrating that you're complying with the requirements of the new regulation. ISO 13485, the 2016 version, was published on the 1st of March 2016, and so the 3-year transition period ends on the 28th of February 2019. It provides requirements for a quality management system that meets regulatory requirements for many jurisdictions, including much of what is required in the EU and for CE marking. Again, it's going to require changes to be made to the quality management system and recertification to the new version of the standard before the end of the transition period. But many of the same processes that need to be changed for the regulations will also need to be changed for the updated version of the standard. So the ideal scenario is to really change the processes once and to manage your changes so that the processes and procedures only need to be handled once rather than undergo multiple changes over time. ISO has issued guidance on 13485 in the form of a handbook. It's called ISO 13485 2016 Medical Devices, a Practical Guide. That is a document that includes all the requirements of the standard, includes the text of the standard, and then under each clause or sub-clause it provides a rationale for the requirement, and then it gives some guidance on how to meet that requirement and the intention behind the requirement. So that is another source of information for your quality management system. So in conclusion, the implementation of the QMS requirements of the regulations and of 13485 will require you to make changes to your quality management system processes. You need to manage those changes through the QMS processes, including having a plan and a quality plan that you can that's documented within your quality management system. Those change processes can then be used to drive changes for the transition, for the technical documentation, the contents of labels, etc., etc. You need to change the process and then use the process to make the changes to the product or the documentation. Whilst the detail of some of the requirements we'll need to know from delegated or implementing acts, I think really we know 80 to 90% of what's going to be required, and for major change management activities, I think we know enough to be able to start, and I'd certainly say that my advice will be don't be paralysed by the small bits that you don't know, but to focus on the things that you do know in order to plan and give some flexibility where there is information that still needs to be made available. It's necessary to understand the depth and the breadth of the changes in order to have an effective implementation plan touching the right processes in the right order to get you into compliance by the time that you need to be there. But what many organisations have found is that the QMS changes are likely to be early in the transition implementation plan, and they will be critical activities on the path to the transition in order to be able to meet the requirements of Article 10 as well as many of the other requirements in the regulations. So with that, I'm going to pause with the slides, and we have a few questions to respond to, and I'll try and deal with those questions that have come in one at a time. So the first question relates to how the quality management system requirements apply to all manufacturers, including Class 1 manufacturers. So as I mentioned, the requirements of Article 10 to have a quality management system apply to all manufacturers, including Class 1 manufacturers, who do not have to go through notified bodies. So whilst that quality management system doesn't have to be certified, it does have to exist and to meet the requirements of the we've had a few questions related to subsidiaries and the relationship between the manufacturer and the authorised representative, the importer or the distributor, where those organisations are subsidiaries of the same entity or the same larger corporation. And the question about whether they all have to have quality management systems, whether all those quality management systems have to be certified, and who needs to conduct some of the verification activities that need to be conducted by distributors and importers on the activities of the manufacturer. So I think to some extent the answer to that question is it's going to have some dependency on the exact relationship, but I think there's a few principles. One of the principles that's really laid out in the regulation is that along the supply chain that each party verifies that the previous party in the chain has met its responsibilities. And I don't think that you can say that doesn't apply because they're all part of the same overall corporate structure. Often subsidiaries may be different legal entities and incorporated in different jurisdictions, and there could be a lot of complexity about the relationship between different parties. My thinking is that if you have a subsidiary in every one of the CE marking countries, then do really every one of those acting as distributors, does every one of those have to verify that the manufacturer has met its responsibilities, or could there be a system, some independent system within the corporation that does that verification and provides that evidence to all of those subsidiaries rather than each of them having to execute that individually? That would seem to be possible. Be possible to me, but I think irrespective of whether they're subsidiaries or not, the roles and responsibilities of those organisations need to be defined and documented. There need to be agreements as to what those roles and responsibilities are and how the communication between those organisations happens, whether they're subsidiaries or whether they're separate organisations not affiliated at all. The next question is not so much about subsidiaries, but it says, does the manufacturer have responsibility to control its distribution chain and the economic actors, for example, through written agreements which would be part of the quality management system? I don't think the regulation explicitly says that, except for the authorised rep, where it does explicitly say that there needs to be a mandate, and that mandate is documented and is part of the quality management system. However, ISO 13485 requires that outsourced activities have to have a written quality agreement accompanying them. And I think you could make a case that these economic actors are conducting outsourced activities for the manufacturer. And irrespective of those requirements, it seems to me that the economic actors each has responsibilities under the regulations, and the manufacturer, for their own purposes, would want to have defined communication methods and roles and responsibilities defined, so that they know how their different parties in their supply chain are going to behave in regard to their responsibilities under the regulation. The next question is there is required to be a post-market surveillance plan? Should we anticipate a required format, or is the expectation that each manufacturer uses a self-created template? I haven't heard that there is a plan for at a European level to produce a common format for this. I'm not sure that there's a requirement to do it. It may be advantageous to do, and something that maybe MedTech Europe or another industry association might come together to look at creating something to benefit manufacturers. The next question is, must communication with regulatory authorities be embedded via written procedures in the quality management system? So 13485 requires that the communications take place in accordance with regulatory requirements. Again, this is an area where it seems to me that it would be beneficial for the organisation to define who has the authority to communicate, for what purposes, with regulatory authorities, notified bodies, just for the purposes of making sure that the communications are clear and documented and recorded and transparent. So I think I would not look at it so much as whether there are requirements around it, so much as being to the organisation's benefit to make sure that the processes for doing this are very clearly defined and understood across its organisation. The penultimate question is with regard to a combination product, where the principal intended use is a pharmaceutical, but there is an app associated with it which is only used with that pharmaceutical and provides information on dosing requirements. And the requirement, so that the regulation now requires the app to meet the general safety and performance requirements of the MDR. And they're asking, are the pharmaceutical current good manufacturing practices sufficient to cover the general safety and performance requirements, or do I need an ISO 13485 certificate? I'm not sure that you need a 13485 certificate, but the difference between 13485 and the pharmaceutical GMPs is that 13485 covers the design and development controls, and that is what takes the general safety and performance requirements as design inputs and puts them into the design and development process, and then verifies that the inputs are met as outputs, and validates and verifies them. So whilst I think this app would not necessarily require certification to 13485, the elements of the design control process, I think, would need to be in whatever quality management system exists. Final question then is, are there changes for the manufacturer regarding the obligation to inform its notified body of substantial changes to the quality management system or the product range? Essentially, the answer to that is no. The requirement for notification of changes to the notified body still remains, and is usually included in the agreement between the manufacturer and the notified body. So with that, I think we've gone on and handled all of the questions that we've had in advance. So thank you very much for your attention and enjoying and joining the webinar today, and I'll hand you back.
Thank you very much, Imon, for delivering this interesting webinar. And dear members, we'll keep you posted about our upcoming webinars. Thank you very much.